Next up is the argument from divine hiddenness. So there are many different arguments from divine hiddenness. It's a bit misleading to say the argument, but here's one way to construe the argument. The first premise would be something like, if a perfectly loving God exists, then there's a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. So the idea behind this premise is that love seems to be like relational. It seems to be self-giving, and it goes beyond mere benevolence and toward a desire for like union with the beloved and a personal relationship with the beloved and involvement with them for its own sake. And so given that God is perfectly loving, it seems like God would always be open to this kind of relationship with creatures. We might ask, along with J.L. Schellenberg, who is one of the main proponents of this argument, how could God count as loving someone if at that time God is sort of closing off the possibility of a relationship with them, if God is preventing them from being able to participate in any meaningful way in a kind of conscious reciprocal relationship with them? It just doesn't seem to fit very nicely with God being perfectly loving. So that's the first premise. If God's perfectly loving, then there's a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. The second premise would be that if there's a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then there's going to be no non-resistant non-belief in God. Okay, so what is non-resistant non-belief? Well, it's just basically people who fail to believe in God, but that's not, their failure to believe in God is not due to like willful, culpable resistance to God on their part. So that's what a non-resistant non-believer is, and that's what non-resistant non-belief is. It's someone whose non-belief is not due to willful, culpable resistance to God or to relationship with God. And so the reason for thinking this premise is true, that if there's a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then there's going to be no non-resistant non-belief. The idea is that the relationship in question, a kind of conscious, meaningful, reciprocal relationship, requires that the other person believes that you exist. Right? You need to have them actually believing that you exist in order to be in a kind of conscious, meaningful, reciprocal relationship with them. And so given that God is open to that, and the other person is also open to that, they're not sort of willfully resisting it, God would take the steps to ensure that they minimally meet the bare necessary conditions for being in a relationship with them, namely believing that God exists. So we get that second premise. But alas, the third premise is that there is non-resistant non-belief in God. And so, given that if there's a God who's always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then there is no non-resistant non-belief. But there is non-resistant non-belief. It follows that there is no such God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. And again, if there is a perfectly loving God at all, then God is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. And so it's going to follow that no perfectly loving God exists. So that's the broad brushstrokes of the argument. There are many ways that one could go in response, but I'll just turn it over to you.
Yeah, very, very well put as ever, Joe. I think it's another powerful one for me, in particular because of the persuasive force it has. I mean, I said before that the problem of evil might be the most popular argument that people use, but really this is possibly slightly more popular. I've advocated that it might actually be a more popular reason, because if you ask people, especially people who haven't like spent a lot of time doing philosophy of religion or whatever, just like, why don't you believe in God? It's like, I don't know, man. I just sort of, he's just not there, you know? I've never felt him, I've never seen him, I've never seen any evidence, like any of that kind of stuff. Then they might talk about evil as well, but a lot of the time, especially for the more sort of passive atheists, it's just not something that they're confronted with. It's just not something they think about. Sure, they'd be perfectly willing to encounter God if he sort of showed up, but it's just not there. So I think it's powerful for that reason. And again, possibly, I mean, for me, I've relied on it so heavily that it's another possible S tier, but I'd understand if it might be a bit lower for various reasons. But for me, this is like the fundamental question. I mean, with the problem of evil, there are like responses that evil seems like this big topic, this huge sort of confusing mystery that's like embedded into at least certain religious traditions like Christianity, God suffering on the cross. But the sort of just God just not being there, that's less present, that's less addressed. It's sort of always assumed. I mean, even the psalmists who will write about their sort of quarrels with God or their confusion about God, they never use this as an argument to think he doesn't exist. They're only ever confused. They're only ever thinking he's evil or they don't understand him properly. It's quite a more modern phenomenon, I think, to use this as reason to think there is just no God. And so I think it's quite powerful. There are, as you say, a number of responses. I mean, what you essentially have to do is deny one of the premises. So some people will say that God has good reason to hide himself from people. And some people say, well, actually, there are no non-resistant non-believers because everyone has enough reason to believe in God, and there's some reason why they're not. The first thing to note is that those two contradict each other. You can't believe both of those responses at once. You can't say that, well, actually, no, there's more than enough evidence for everyone to believe, and at the same time say, oh, but God also has good reason to not allow people to believe. That can't be true at once. God might have reason to restrict evidence from people, but then for me, an interesting subset of this argument is the problem of religious geographic distribution. So the fact that statistically speaking, you are far more likely to be a theist if you're born in Rwanda, say, one of the most Catholic countries in the world, than if you're born in Thailand, which is like 90-something% Buddhist, and Buddhism is atheistic, therefore you don't believe in God. So if Christianity is true, for example, then your place of birth is a statistically reliable indicator of how likely you are to be saved. That doesn't seem so great. And people will say that this commits the genetic fallacy of you sort of believing something for the wrong reason doesn't make it true, doesn't make it false. That's of course that is of course accurate. However, if you believe that it's being supervised by a God who loves everybody equally and wants to come to know everybody, like you say, then why would he hide his face more from the Thai than from the Rwandans? Or is it just that the Thai are just naturally like orders of magnitude more resistant than the Rwandans are? And if that's the case, then why are they built in that way? You know what I mean? So there are so many problems as to God's seeming arbitrary desire and ability to reveal himself to some and not to others. There are those who even don't want to believe in God, like C.S. Lewis's conversion. He talks about dragging his eyes darting like a desperate animal for any means of escape, dragged into belief in God. And there are those of us who go, please just give me something, and they get nothing. So the arbitrariness of God's revelation, the geographical distribution of God's revelation, and also the fact that it doesn't seem to accord with people's desires, seems to me to undermine belief in God quite powerfully.
Yeah, I think the point about geographical distribution is a very good one. And it also highlights that, we can run this argument in different ways. We don't have to put it as a deductive argument saying that, listen, God's existence is like strictly incompatible with the existence of non-resistant non-believers. We can just say like, the fact that there are non-resistant non-believers, many of them, and the geographical distribution of them, at least just seems incredibly surprising on the hypothesis that there is indeed a perfectly loving God who is open and desires a personal relationship with everyone who is indeed willing. So it's just pointing to different variants of this argument. And I also like how the geographical distribution point serves a bunch of different purposes. So another purpose that it serves is to render it very implausible that everyone who fails to believe in God, that's always due to some kind of like willful, culpable resistance to God on their part. So it's like there's something like unique about like Thailand. Is there something in the water there or something? Like what is going on? It's just so overwhelmingly implausible. And they're historical and isolated peoples. Many people are non-believers because they like literally have no concept of the theistic God. You go back many thousands of years ago, like isolated tribal peoples alive today even. And again, many of our ancestors from many thousands of years ago. I mean, deconverting is often accompanied by like extremely negative social and familial repercussions, anxiety, depression, lots of other things like that. Again, doesn't seem to be like culpable, willful resistance God or like a desire to sin or anything like that. And I mean, like just in general, theists would rightly and frequently do laugh off suggestions that like all theists believe in God for emotional or psychological reasons. Ultimately, like that's really what's driving them. It's just like wishful thinking. And they typically say, no, that's silly. And just as that's silly, it's equally silly to say that literally all non-believers fail to believe in God for reasons of like willful, culpable resistance or immorality or something like that. Like you can't have your cake and eat it too, trusting your own introspection and testimony of fellow theists while distrusting the introspection and testimony of others. So I don't think it's particularly promising to go the route of denying non-resistant non-belief. And in fact, there are many more reasons to think that there at least are some non-resistant non-believers. And I would personally want to construe this argument as a kind of, like evidential type argument. And again, I mean, we could go through lots of more objections. I mean, I don't know if you want to cover others, but we could rank it. Yeah.
I mean, it's worth mentioning that, I mean, we've spoken there about denying the existence of non-resistant non-believers. Oh, everyone just resists. But there's also the other premise of saying, well, maybe there are non-resistant non-believers, but God has good reason to allow them. One reason that's often given is that if God made his existence obvious to everyone, it would be like epistemically overpowering and would like remove our free will in choosing to believe in him. Like to have a relationship with someone, you have to have sort of a free choice. But if God's existence was just plainly obvious all the time, then we'd essentially be sort of, we'd have no choice but to just believe in him and come to love him. And that doesn't seem very nice. It doesn't give us a level of freedom. This comes up a lot. I think it fails for like so many reasons. For a start, you don't need to make yourself sort of overbearingly present just to prove your existence. I just need like one, foolproof indication once in my life that this God exists. And then the rest of the time, he could still be sort of distant or away or whatever. But as long as I've got that one experience that tells me that he definitely exists, that would be enough just to convince me of his existence. I mean, that would be fine. The second thing to say is that there are people, even within religious traditions, who are certain of God's existence and yet still do not choose to enter into a relationship with him. So Satan, famously, is an example of someone who knows God's existence but chooses not to believe in him. So it seems like possible to still have that freedom even if God's existence is obvious. Secondly, it does seem to sort of undercut where people like to argue that God's existence is evident everywhere and there's all this evidence abounding that people are just blind to. It sort of undercuts that too. So there are a lot of reasons I think why that's probably not worth taking super seriously. I'm not sure if you've got anything to add there.
No, I think that's spot on. And the argument does not require that God's like always hovering over your shoulders, or like God would just be like blindingly obvious. He'd be in the sky, just like watching over us all the time. Like the argument is about like God securing the necessary preconditions for us being in a conscious reciprocal relationship with him. All that requires is that, we have a belief in God or something like that. It doesn't require God to be like constantly experientially present. He can still be experientially distant, which can allow us to have free will and so on, even though we nevertheless continually maintain belief in him. It's like, it's just like your mother. Your mother is not always hovering over your shoulder. That can still allow you to, go to the party and like, take a sip of the beer when you're like 17 or something. But, that doesn't detract from, but you still believe in your mother's existence when you do that, right? And like, your mother's existence is obvious to you, but that doesn't like threaten your ability to like engage in a free, meaningful relationship with your mother and so on. So like, I don't know, it's just not a plausible response. If there is a response that if I were a theist, I would take, it would be something along the lines of, yes, God does indeed sometimes have reason to permit there being non-resistant non-believers, because sometimes that can make for much greater relationship goods down the line, and even great relationship goods in the present. I think if God exists, it seems plausible to me, actually, that non-theists could have an implicit relationship with God by loving and deeply pursuing truth and beauty and goodness and justice. Since if God exists, like these are all intimately bound up with God and his nature in certain ways. And so, arguably, non-theists are getting closer to God. Even though they don't know it, they're getting closer to God and getting acquainted with God and actually building a relationship with God when they're being committed to doing morally good things, and they're being committed to loving truth and pursuing truth and cultivating virtue and doing all these sorts of things. It's similar to, when Jesus said in, I forget which gospel it is, maybe it's multiple gospels, but Jesus basically, there are various people who fed the hungry and clothed the naked. And they said to Jesus, like, Lord, when did we do these things for you? And Jesus replied to them, well, whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me. So it's like, by helping other people, we are, even if we don't know it, we are indeed kind of serving God. And so non-theists, if God exists, non-theists actually can be in a kind of implicit relationship with God. And oftentimes that may actually sometimes be more valuable, at least for them in the current moment, than an explicit relationship with them. Like despite the fact that they don't think there's any reward in the afterlife or something like that, they are committing to truth and they are committing to goodness and these sorts of things. And so
there's good practical reason for, like, everyone loves a good conversion story. C.S. Lewis, I already mentioned recently, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She sells out a crowd. I don't know if it's sold out, but this crowd in New York come to listen to her talk to Richard Dawkins about why she's now a Christian, and it's quite a beautiful, moving story that lots of people are clapping and applauding, and maybe there's some utility in a conversion which you can't get if somebody spends some amount of time not believing in God. The problem I have with that, though, I mean, what you said was sort of like implicit relationship anyway, but some people have suggested, well, by being a non-believer, you sort of move towards a relationship with God, and there's something better about becoming one of God's children where you were not before. It's sort of like a prodigal son-esque. This is better because you know what it is not to believe, and now you do. One interesting problem I have with that is the existence of libertarian free will. So, like, suppose we say, well, God is allowing me to be an atheist now because one day I'm going to discover his existence, convert to Christianity, but there's some value in that process. Maybe, look, I'm a YouTuber, and if I convert to Christianity over in the next few years, that will, bring the message to a lot of people. Cool. But if you believe in libertarian free will, if you believe that people have free will, then somebody could break into my house right now and slit my throat. And if they do that, if they happen to choose to do that before the time that God had allotted for me to convert to Christianity, then it seems like I would not inherit eternal life because I didn't accept Christianity by the time that I died. Whereas if I'd have been alive for another few years than I would have done, which means that my salvation, my going to heaven or hell, is determined not by God, not by me, but the choice of any random person who could come and slit me in the throat. There are, of course, responses to that. Maybe God would just treat me how he knows I would have behaved if I stayed alive. Maybe God, knowing when I'm going to die, would change the sort of course of effects or course of events or whatever. But it's worth considering. So lots of lines to go down, lots of interesting things to think about. Another probably quite familiar one to the audience, though. Where do you think it ranks?
Well, it has, I mean, it does have, at least as we were saying and arguing, it does have some modicum of plausibility to it. And like you can kind of, this is what, like you said, this is what so many atheists think to themselves. It's like, he just doesn't seem present. And, so many even religious believers struggle with this. It's like, if God really does want a personal relationship with me and I'm open to it, then why does he seem so absent? So I do think that there's some plausibility to the argument. Of course, there are back and forth objections and so on, but I'm inclined to put it pretty high up.
It seems plausible for me you're right. It does just feel like, God's not there. But then there is the sort of story of the fish looking for the water, or Immanuel Kant's image of the dove flying through the air and feeling the wind resistance and thinking, gosh, if only I could just get rid of this air that's holding me back. If I could just get rid of it, I'd be able to fly so much easier. There is a sort of possibility that we can't see it like the air that we're breathing. Glenn Scrivener has a book called The Air We Breathe, about the sort of culture of Christianity that surrounds us without us realizing it. But that analogy can also be used for God's existence as a whole. Like, maybe it's just like so foundational that it sort of, you stop noticing it. Like how you don't notice that you're speaking a language when you say sentences, because it's just sort of the mechanism that you've embodied. So there's some plausibility in a response like that. It doesn't take away the feeling of people sort of trying to pay attention and noticing. But it's certainly like, and those kinds of responses, I think, unlike the problem of evil, when somebody says something like that, it's kind of, I think it's more difficult to like double down on the point and be like, come on, man, like look at this deer on fire in a forest and tell me that this is, because God needed to invent bravery or something. It is just ludicrous. Whereas when somebody says, look, man, I know you don't feel his presence, but you got to understand that you're interacting with it wrong, or that he's there in ways that you wouldn't otherwise understand. It's like, it's more difficult to just be like, come on, man, like, look at this thing. So maybe it's more sort of like, I would say A tier at least, but I'm thinking maybe A rather than S.
Yeah, I'd be cool with A tier. Just one final thing that I want to mention. So I think I agree with A tier, so we can put it in there. But one final thing that I do want to mention is that we might think that the Hiddenness argument, or certain versions of the Hiddenness argument, are successful against certain versions of God or God's existence or religion. Like, if you have a particular brand of Christianity which predicates one's salvation or one's consignment to hell on one's beliefs, right, in my view, this actually is an incredibly powerful argument against that version of Christianity. It just seems so implausible to me that, let's say, someone in Thailand, who just through no fault of their own has never even heard of Jesus Christ or something like that. Or, like the hunter-gatherers who are living in isolated parts of the world, like literally causally isolated from everyone else, have never even heard of Jesus Christ or God or things like that. And so through no fault of their own, they fail to believe, and yet they're being consigned to hell on the basis of that. That just seems so overwhelmingly implausible. It just seems patently unjust to me. And it's a version of the divine hiddenness argument as targeting these particular brands of Christianity. Not all versions of Christianity are committed to that. I want to highlight that, but at least many people are. And it's just, or like like the 12-year-old Jewish girl who, through no fault of her own, doesn't believe in Christ. She hasn't been presented with the relevant evidence. Her family just has always told her that Judaism is true. All of her evidence speaks to Judaism being true through no fault of her own, and so through no fault of her own, she fails to believe in Christ. It's just so. It's just not plausible to me as an objection.
I think it's
anyway.
worth pointing out as well. Not again. I don't want to dwell here because we'll take forever. But I think it is worth mentioning on this geographical distribution point that, like you say, some people think that to be saved, you need to know about Jesus. I think that's wildly implausible. I think so do a lot of Christians. Jesus is the way that people come to be saved, but not knowledge of Jesus. It's Jesus' sacrifice. The thing that matters, and in fact, I think Jesus emphasizes this in the Christian tradition, the thing that matters to him is that you do the will of the Father. Like, doing the will of the Father is the important thing. Being a good person, doing the right stuff. And so, interestingly, and St. Paul writes in the first epistle to the Romans, in the first chapter, verse 20 reads, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So quite like fierce language, people are without excuse. It's like written into the world and onto their hearts. But he also does describe them as invisible qualities, as if to say they're not things that you can see and quantify, and yet they're so obvious that people are without excuse for not paying attention to them. It's worth bearing in mind that some people say that's what matters. So the 12-year-old Jewish girl who's never heard of Jesus, well, she's still going to have a moral conscience. And if she follows that moral conscience, then she's doing the will of the Father. And so for a Christian, for example, you might say that, well, America is way more Christian than Iran. And somebody might say, well, nominally, yeah, more people call themselves Christians in America than call themselves Christians in Iran. But a lot of American Christians aren't really living a particularly Christian life. And a lot of people in Iran who, despite being Muslims, are still living a life which broadly is sort of in keeping with the will of the Father. They've got a moral conscience. They look after their family, etc. And so although there might be less people who call themselves Christian in Iran, there might be more people doing the will of the Father in Iran, which means that across the geographic distribution, if what you're counting is who calls himself a theist, who calls himself a Christian, sure, there's a big variance. But if you're actually looking for who's doing the right thing and living a good life, you might find that it's much more evenly distributed. Just thought that was worth mentioning, which is, another reason why I think maybe not quite worthy of the S tier.
Yeah, no, I think we're in agreement with that. So A tier it is.
A tier. All right, let me put that in. Divine Hiddenness, A tier. Okay,